It gives me incredible pleasure to facilitate this session. So welcome everybody. It's the end of the day of what's been amazing from my perspective, understanding and sharing what's going on. But I'm particularly pleased that we've got this session about the Senate, not only because the way into the Senate is different to the House of Reps, but the role of the Senate and understanding how communities can use their senators to get things done. And the relationship between the House of Reps and the Senate is just incredibly important. So I am just so looking forward to the next hour, getting to know both David and Claire, and then the discussion between us about how we can liberate, I think, for the community's benefit, the Senate and understand it better. So I'm going to start with you, David. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, obviously, and what do you think about your job? And with, of course, with a particular emphasis is on the community part of it. So maybe 7 or 8 minutes of that, and then Claire will give you the same question before we open it up for more general discussion. So David, tell us a little bit about you, why you're a community senator, and how do you see your job working out?
Thanks, Cathy. And I mean, publicly, thank you so much for all the work you've done in this space, really making all this possible for so many community independents to do what we're now doing, representing our communities. I played professional rugby for 15 years, and through that was always interested in politics. I grew up in Zimbabwe, so I'd seen how bad it could be, and as a new Australian, felt really grateful to live here, grateful for the opportunity, and fell in love with Australia. And I think when you love somewhere, you want to contribute and make it better. And so I'd been involved in campaigns around climate, homophobia in sports, marriage equality. But to be honest, I never really thought I would sort of formally get involved in politics. And then finished up start of 2020, start of COVID. And the following year had heard that there was this group in Canberra called ProACT that were essentially doing what was done in Indi, starting to have conversations, share frustrations, talk about the possibility of having an independent. And I'll let Claire talk more about this, because she was one of the founders of ProACT, but I'd sort of been watching them from afar. They were running, it was COVID, so they were running webinars. I'd watched a couple of them, and at the same time was actually mostly in Southern Africa working on a agriculture and conservation project. So it was very much, this is really cool to see happening in Canberra. Love what they're doing. But that was about it. And then a couple of people who had been involved in the process contacted me and said, listen, your name keeps coming up in these conversations. Would you consider running? And initially I thought, oh, that's very nice, but I'm pretty busy doing other things that I think are meaningful and I'm sort of enjoying. But the more I thought about it, the opportunity to actually represent a community I love on all these issues that are important to me, and seeing, I guess, the impact that could actually be made in politics at a federal level, knowing, the ACT has led on a number of issues at a territory level. I don't feel like we've seen that same leadership at a federal level. And so I was mulling it over a little bit, getting a bit more interested, and then actually went up to COP26 in Glasgow for the project I was working on in Zimbabwe. And that's where it really hit me how out of step Australia is when it comes to climate. We know we're being left behind, but when you actually see it at a conference like that, it was embarrassing. But then too, you see how much people actually sort of hold Australia up as an example, as a place that should be getting on with this, that people are actually looking to for leadership. And it really busted that whole thing of politicians saying, well, Australia's 1 or 2% of emissions, so it doesn't really matter what we do. It does matter. We can have an impact. And so, yeah, it was thinking more about it after that. And I think the thing that did it was something that I thought if I didn't actually have a crack at, I'd probably be sort of regret or feel like, oh, what could have been. And so decided to put my hand up, went through the ProACT process, which was a big town hall, and got grilled by a few hundred people for, I don't know how long, hour and a half. And then was, I guess, put on the short list and went through the next step, which was they had a selection committee, and then they sort of grilled me in a lot more detail and then was endorsed. And it was kind of straight into things. I'm sure we'll get to it a bit later, but, you know, one of the things, the differences with the Senate is that to have your name on the ballot paper above the line, you have to be a political party, which is a complicating factor. And so essentially straight away try to launch.
So I'll come back to that. So can I just, in summary?
Yeah.
So first off, there was a community group.
Yeah.
Profound. Community group when seeking somebody, so they tap people on the shoulder.
Yep.
You said yes, and then there was a campaign. So if I could say to all those 189 people listening, that's exactly the same process that happens in the House of Reps. Community groups first, working out what they want, go and find the standout stellar candidate. Candidate says yes, and then we have a campaign. So that's it. So if you're wanting to know how you do it, that's it. So now I'm going to pass over to you, Claire, because the Senate is a little bit different, and David was just going to start on it, but I'll give you the chance to talk a little bit about how does the Senate work, because we're all keen to know more about it, and how did you make the magic happen?
Well, there was a lot of people that made the magic happen. Yeah, as you mentioned, Cathy, there's a lot of similarities, isn't there, in terms of that pathway. I mean, for us, I really believe, you know, politics is about people. Or rather it should be, and it can be. And no matter how you define democracy, you know, whether it's rule of the people or a lovely quote that I heard recently, which is, you know, it's the art of solving collective problems. Whatever that is, it has to come back to the people and the community. And so that's been the kind of thread that has gone through for us last year, you know, during that process that David mentioned, during the campaign and onwards. And while, yes, there's a lot of similarities, and, you know, hearing the panel just after lunch about some of the kind of campaigns, there was a lot that was very similar. But I think there are some differences with the Senate as well. You know, David mentioned the difference around the lead time of needing to ensure that you've got enough time. You know, getting a party up takes 12 weeks. That's a long time. You need 1,500 votes. But there are some other differences as well, and probably it's also worth mentioning that the ACT is a little bit different to the states as well, so a kind of complicating factor that so, you know, 12 senators in the states, but in the ACT there's only 2. In the states, they come up every second time, so, you know, it's a 6-year term, and every election half of that group comes up, whereas in the ACT the 2 senators are just for the 3-year period and come up every election. So some differences as well, and that had to inform the way that we went about it. So yes, we had those kitchen table conversations to find out what's important to people. Yes, we asked for names, and there was 26 names put forward, so lots of great conversations. David's came up a lot along the way, having that kind of community process. But some differences as well. We did put a lot more emphasis, I suspect, around some of the analysis of the numbers, because the Senate voting system is more complex. So we did, and by we, I should say my partner Glenn, who was the sort of Anthony Green of ProACT and the campaign, who analysed down to every single booth, more than 90 booths, the voting patterns and the preferences flows for the last elections, how that meshed against the ACT territory results as well, to ensure that there actually was a pathway. And also within that had probably a greater emphasis on some of the sort of civic education element as well. The Senate is a complicated beast. Most people don't know the technicalities of that, and so weaving in sort of a bit of building knowledge around the Senate, and that there is a pathway, as well as having those conversations with people about what was important. So a few differences, as well as a pretty common thread across other campaigns as well.
So fantastic. I want to explore a little bit more the stuff about campaigning and lessons that you learned from that. Can you just tell me a little bit, because then I want to actually talk about the role now. So is there any sort of can you share with us, or what have you learned about the success of your campaign that can be useful for other people? And then we'll leave the campaign behind us and we'll move on to the future. I'll go back to you, Claire. So what advice have you got for other people who want to run in other states, who want to run community independence, some things that you learned, and then I'll pass it on to you, David.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the first thing to say is that every context is very different, and the difference between state versus ACT is to acknowledge that. And the fact that it doesn't necessarily need to, there's different ways of communities coming together and organising. I don't think it necessarily needs to have a voices of group, although we called ourselves a little bit differently. We went for ProACT to emphasise that ACT identity of being pro the ACT and proactive about getting change. That's obviously one pathway, but there can be other pathways as well. But the key elements, I think, for us, was the right candidate, the right time, and the right community groundswell. So, the right candidate in terms of someone that we were hearing, a name that we were continually hearing. And the reason I think that we were hearing it was around David's the principles and values that people could see that he lived, that having a track record on the issues that were important to people, and his ability to engage not just across the political spectrum, but with people who are not interested in politics. So that kind of breadth were the kinds of things that came up very often. So the right candidate, the right time, and I think that's both a combination of having an unpopular incumbent, shall we say, someone who wasn't necessarily representing the views of many Canberrans, the sense of this national movement for independence, which meant that there was some funding and tools and things available. So the right time, but also the right community groundswell, I think, is just so important. There's many other things about the campaign as well, about, being savvy in the media and the right policies and so on, but to mobilise, well over 2,000 people, and the kinds of, when we did a campaign review and did a survey to volunteers, the kinds of things that were coming back from people were of, having this sense, a very clear shared goal, and a clear sense of what the pathway to success was, around leadership and getting the right people in the right roles, an emphasis on a kind of face-to-face engagement and building that sense of community, but also a sense of the social side of things, and that it was fun to be part of and meaningful to be part of. So all of those sorts of were the threads of feedback that we were getting from people, but that collectively meant that we had that right groundswell at the right time behind the right candidate. And I think, yeah, to me, it's that kind of combination that was really powerful.
Thank you. I just got to say to you, poor David, you have to just listen to your ears about all that conversation about the right candidate, because it's good. But so from your perspective, leaving aside being the right candidate, what do you think worked in the whole business of your being successful in this getting to the Senate? Some ideas that you can share with others.
I can't actually see my ears. I think it's cutting them off with this this background. But I mean, for me, it's the people, right? I was blown away. It was so humbling to see people put their time and effort into being part of this movement. And for me, it was about getting people engaged, having the right team that can help generate a feeling of people sort of having a stake in this being not just let's try and get David elected, but we're doing this together. And I think over time that started to build this momentum that you could feel it in the ACT. Over time, that more and more people were talking about it, more and more people were coming to events. So for me, it really was first and foremost about people. And at the start of the campaign, we sat down and said, how can we make politics about people? And for us, that was engaging our volunteers, and then them engaging people they knew. And I think that was how we ended up being successful. On top of that, I think the other big thing was tapping into the issues, actually doing the work of having thousands of conversations and working out these are the issues for different groups of people. I think that's one of the distinctions, the bigger distinctions between a lower house seat and a Senate seat. And I guess probably maybe with the exception of somewhere like Indi, that is sort of not an inner city electorate, which is probably a little bit more homogenous, a smaller number of people. In the ACT, it's the whole territory. So you've got a wide range of people from different backgrounds, different socioeconomic sort of status, all these things. And so if you look at my website, the policy platform was pretty broad. We were talking about a lot of different issues, and having to then go and sit down with experts and say, okay, well, what's the best sort of policy thing we could be doing here? And then having events around issues. So we had a forum on aged care, we had a forum on housing affordability, we had a youth forum, we had a sort of smart energy transition forum, as ways to actually draw in people based on these different interests. And I think over time that it breaks down the perception. And this is what the incumbent did, was just try and paint me as an extreme green one-trick pony. But as the campaign went on, because we were engaging on these other issues and actually coming up with really sensible policy suggestions, that really just didn't stick. So
okay, so there's
looking back, those are probably the two biggest things.
So there's a few things that you haven't actually talked about, but I'm pulling out from what you're saying is the leadership that you provided. Like you had a pretty clear idea that you needed to be there for everybody. So you were able to provide that. And that sense that you were actually putting people first. It wasn't vote for me because I'm wonderful. It was actually, how do we get people to be the center of our politics? Is that have I got that right? And then there was something else that those events. So you actually walk the talk, as if I sort of like I'm showing you by doing, that was part of your campaign, that you're actually open to ideas. And I imagine people who participated in those events got to hear from you and got to hear what sort of person you were. So they got a sense that was, so you actually you walked the talk as you did the campaign. Would that be right?
I think that's right. And, it wasn't just my leadership. I think the success was, the core campaign team, Claire did a huge amount, wrangling, a couple thousand volunteers. So there was sort of the core team that was really working closely together. And then a group of area leaders that were then working with, different parts of the ACT.
Yeah, so structure and organisation.
Yeah, so having the right structure to be able to actually do it, and then just you know, you know all about it. Just a huge amount of work every day of the week. You know.
And that common thread around listening, isn't it? You know, in terms of that engagement of having, yes, the bigger events, but also the, you know, events that are small enough that you can actually listen to people and engage at a very human level.
Okay, so let's take the conversation to this next place, which really interests me, is the role of better government with the Senate and the House of Reps. And one of the bits of advice I got when I first got elected to Parliament was, how do you do this job? How do you get things done? And a guy called John Clements, who'd been an advisor to Tony Windsor, he came and had a cup of tea with me. He says, Cathy, first off, you've got to go to get to know your senators. And I said, why would I do that? Like, what's got, you know, how's that got to do anything? Like, it's my own naivety. I had no understanding of the role of the Senate in terms of getting things done. I mean, I knew all the theory, but I didn't actually understand the relationship stuff. So John said, you've got to get to know all the senators in your electorate, and you've got to get to know them well. And I said, well, how do I do that? And he said, well, like, read their first speeches, ring them up, go and have a cup of coffee with them, you know, do the work, which is, I ended up doing that with the 12 Victorian senators. And I was just surprised, really surprised at how clever, engaged, knowledgeable, regardless of the party that they were. And by the time I'd left those meetings, had set up with each of the 12 senators for Victoria, like my Venn diagrams of what we had in common, like sort of a commitment that we could work on X together. And it was such a positive experience for me and such a surprise that I ended up doing that with all the senators. It was really quite a bit of work, but I got to know them really well. And I could, for all of them, they had interests that overlapped with mine. So just the story was that then in my first year, there was a big argument in the House of Reps where Christopher Pyne wanted to cut the funding to universities. He wanted to deregulate the university sector and put it out to competition. And Tony Abbott was in government, was the Prime Minister. So it just quickly, it got through the House of Reps, the government won the debate. But when it got to the Senate, Clive Palmer and his Palmers, the United, they didn't want it either. So we had a core base there, and then Nick Xenophon as well. But it was before we even knew it. We knew we had the numbers in the Senate. Like, it wasn't that they were a natural, they didn't know they shared the view until someone from the House of Reps came and said, this is not going to work for rural and regional Australia. Can you work with us? And anyhow, they did. And the first time it went up to the Senate, the government lost it by two votes, and then Christopher Pyne straight away went and put it up again, and they lost it by 2 votes the second time. So our whole education system didn't get deregulated because the House of Reps and the Senate worked together. And when we stopped something happening rather than making something happening. But it was such an insight to me of how the power there. And then when Rebecca Sharkey got into Parliament and we had the Centre Alliance, you know, her ability to work on the crossbench just was so effective. So what I'm wanting to do now is open up a discussion, I suppose, with both of you about how do you see your roles in taking the community voice into the Senate. I think many people listening can understand how the community voice goes into the House of Reps, but how does it work in the Senate? So I'd be fascinated in your thoughts on that, David.
How does it work in terms of
getting things done?
Sorry?
In getting things done.
Well, you know, I think the great thing about the Senate is that the government hardly ever has the majority. I think the last time was under Howard. So it is a real check and balance, and there's the ability to really scrutinize legislation that's coming from a government that holds the majority in the lower house. And you can do that by potentially just rejecting bills, or actually working to try and amend them and increase the ambition or tweak them a little bit. And I think that's really exciting over this next 3 years with the crossbench holding that that balance of power on things that the government and the opposition don't agree on, you actually have that real sort of power and lever to be able to be raising what the people you represent want, and to be looking at, and the thing that I said during the campaign, my commitment to people in the ACT is each piece of legislation, I'm going to say, like, how will this affect people of the ACT, and how does this square with the kind of future we want to build in Australia? And I think to have independents that don't have these party lines that are cooked up to win votes in WA as well as Queensland, we're going to get better outcomes.
Okay, Claire, what's your sense of this? Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, you go.
I mean, I don't know the technicalities of how things work in the Senate, so, you know, interested in your thoughts on that, Cathy. But I guess for me, the threads around the community involvement and engagement has to be there. So, you know, and the kinds of things that David has already, you know, started to implement on that. So, you know, whether it's around the kind of participation element of with, you know, volunteer program, or, you know, that kind of transparency around voting records and newsletters and so on, the accountability element, like already having, you know, has already done one town hall, and there's already, you know, more to planned. Those sorts of threads have to be there as the ways, the mechanisms to maintain and entrench that community connection. I think we're also really lucky in the ACT that we have, I mean, every community has its experts, but I think the ACT has a very high proportion of incredibly talented people who we can tap into and ensure that expertise is felt there. So for me, it's about, you know, this stage is getting some of those mechanisms in place, so that there is the way for the community to be involved, and David to report back and set up that relationship, and then it becomes about the breadth and depth of that, you know, breadth in terms of widening who is involved and spoken to and listened to, and the depth of that engagement as well. So that would, to me, would be the next steps.
Okay, well, let me just tell you a story that's quite different from what you just talked about, Claire, but I'll put it in there. One of the things is I was, as a House of Reps member, I went and met all these senators and got to like them and asked them about their job and what their interests were. And there was a particular senator who had a real interest in public transport, and she was a Victorian senator, and public transport was a really big issue in my electorate. So that's all fine. I knew that we shared a bit of a philosophy about this. And at the same time, in my electorate, there was a reference group, and we've been talking about these. A reference group formed. It was called the Border Rail Action Group, and border is Albury-Wodonga border. And that Border Rail Action Group took responsibility for being the Indi community voice on this issue of public transport. So that's all fine. They were they were the sort of the reference group to me to help improve our trains. So that was all fine. And we had a volunteer program happening in Indi that sort of sadly, because of COVID, has fallen away. But so volunteers could come and work in my office. So one of the engineering guys who was part of the Border Rail Action Group, or two of them actually, they came up and volunteered in my Canberra office for a week. And we had a process for this, so people weren't just left alone. There was an induction process and support and mentoring and all that sort of business. And it just so happened that while they were there, the Senate estimates was going on. And one of the engineers went through the program for the Senate estimates and said, the Transport Communications Committee, can I go and listen to those? And I said, oh yeah, that's no problem. You go and have a listen. So he went to the Senate estimates, and his eyes, the scales fell off his eyes, the muffs fell off his ears, and he came to understand the power of Senate estimates. And he came back to the office and he was just all agog. He says, you know, you can get anything you want out of the Senate estimates. And we can, like, he's just a bloke, retired, you know, an engineer. anyhow, he came back so excited, and it was just too much energy for me. So I said, look, you need to go and talk to this senator, because she knows all about it. So he straight away, we made an appointment. He went across and he met the senator from Victoria who knew about transport. So the long and the short of it is the senator said to him, look, I can see you know a huge amount about tracks. Would you like to draft up some questions for me to use in Senate estimates? So John came back again like, oh, she's going to do this. So I said, well, you draft the questions up. My staff will go through them. We'll finesse them, and then you can send them off. Anyhow, that was the start of what became the most profound relationship, and ended up in us getting $354 million for the Victorian Railway. So every Senate estimates, John would draft up the questions, the senator would deliver them, and over a period of 2 years, they sort of had a waterfall effect. They'd ask questions, get some answers, get bum steers, then they'd come back and they'd follow it up. And over a period of 2 years, they really narrowed it down so that the Australian Rail Track Corporation just had to, they were the right questions delivered in Parliament, and they couldn't obfuscate and not do it. So the end of that was that we had a partnership between a community-based reference group who knew their stuff, a senator who was really keen about it, and we used the Senate estimates process on behalf of the community. Now, that all worked really well, but there was an added ingredient to it that made it so special, is the social media side of the Boyle Rail Action Group. So they came back and then they spoke to the whole community about what they'd done, and there were regular updates. So not only did they learn how the Senate estimates worked, they were able to teach everybody else in the community how the Senate estimates worked. And then, so when people would come to me and ask me about a particular problem that needed change, John would then become the mentor to the other community group about how to do questions in writing to the Senate and how to set up other meetings. So that relationship was profound. And me as a member of Parliament, I wasn't the centre of it. Our office was the facilitator of it. And so when eventually the money came down to the Victorian Rail Track Corporation to fix up our railway line, we'd set up a partnership with the Green Senator, the Victorian State Government Labor. The money came out of the National Party budget, and it was all sort of orchestrated by a community reference group of volunteer engineers. So I just wanted to put that story out here because to me, it was profound about how you could liberate the power of community if either both the Senate office and our office provided the mechanism for the community to do its own work. So that was one example. We also had really fantastic examples on gender dysphoria, getting the rules changed around that, working in partnership with the Senate. So on the question, so that's a bit of a long story because I wanted to ask you, David, like you, I have a real passion for agriculture, and I'm particularly interested in regenerative agriculture. And lots of people talk to me about the failure, obviously the National Party has no policy at all on it. The Liberal Party have no policy at all on it. So you're the only person I know in Parliament who actually understands regenerative agriculture. Now, whether or not you like it, you're probably going to be the spokesperson for it because no one else, or Helen Haynes perhaps, maybe Rebecca Sharkey at a push, but you actually understand it. So when people come and talk to me about climate change and regenerative agriculture and being the face of it, I'm going to send them to you because you're the only one I know who even has an understanding of it. So when we had the opportunity for this panel today, and we haven't talked about it before, but I'm really interested in your ideas about how community might engage with you around getting some policy for Australia around regen ag that actually brings the community with it, not government top-down telling us, actually builds the movement. So that's a cold call. But I was fascinated in your thought.
Please do send them my way. I have a farming background. I think regenerative agriculture is just such an incredible opportunity for Australia, and representing the ACT, it's not like we have a big farming community, but we all eat food. And most people care about the health of the land, and regenerative agriculture can and has to be at the forefront of helping to deal with the climate and the biodiversity crisis. And it can, and we've got some of the world's experts in regen ag here in Australia, but most people have never heard of them. We don't celebrate them and talk about them like we should. So I think it's a conversation that we should be having, not just in the regions, but in cities too, about the kind of food that we're buying. And I think we saw through COVID and then through these natural disasters with floods, having more sort of resilient local food systems is incredibly important and a huge benefit. And I think that there are some opportunities. David Littleproud's been working on a carbon and biodiversity sort of certification scheme, which has some real potential to actually be rewarding farmers who are farming in a way that is sequestering carbon, that is creating more wildlife habitat. So yeah, I think we need to be coming at it from every angle, from consumers doing everything they can to buy food that is grown by farmers who really care, to the government actually rewarding farmers and incentivizing that. And again, to come back to the Senate, that one of the things that the Senate does is has all these committees and can hold sort of inquiries and really bring in experts and grill them and put together reports. And I think being in Canberra, again, having all these experts to be able to ask the right questions, to really dig a little bit deeper and get below the sort of superficial layer that you tend to always see when it is estimates, and you just get kind of the straight bat answer. To try and get around that, that's when I think we're going to start to get the interesting stuff and start to see some progress. And just looking at the chat, Hannah-Beth Luke, who ran Up in Page, I know her through sort of Regen Ag. She was a lecturer in one of the courses, and so there are all these experts out there, and I think we should be celebrating them and actually furthering this conversation. So I'd love to chat more at some stage.
Well, do you have any ideas, Claire, of how that whole conversation we can bring the community together on this topic?
I mean, it's not a topic that I have expertise on, but I think the same principles, apply, isn't it, in terms of the mix of having a mix of people in the room, and directing, having a pathway for that information to be going somewhere, isn't it? So, the same threads of whatever the topic is. But for me, what I think is important is the diversity of those perspectives, and who we see as the experts, and what are the range of views that we listen to, and that's the case on this topic as well as other topics as well.
So I'll just push this point a little bit further, because I hear your answer. It's very general, Claire. So a lot of people listening who've come on for this convention are looking for really practical things that they can do about very specific problems. And there is a whole lot of stuff in the chat now about regen, and you can see people are really interested in it. So David, I'm going to put it to you that when the climate change bill comes to the Senate, would you be talking to the government about, or maybe not climate, I don't know. Are there opportunities for you to actually say, well, this is a really important topic, and it's not just climate? For example, Helen Haynes was able to move an amendment to say that when they're going to do the recording, they've actually got to pay particular attention to the impact on rural and regional Australia. So it was a very specific, but it'll change the way that legislation is rolled out, because they're now going to have to collect data for the regions separately to the nation. And in doing that, the people who are responsible will have to change the way they work. So that's the power of legislation. Is there anything that you can think of that we can, in terms of agriculture and rural and regional Australia, do a better job on the climate that picks up on some of these topics that we really care about?
With the 43% bill that'll be in the Senate next time Parliament sits, I don't think anything like that would be on the table with the government. The one thing that I will be suggesting is how we actually report on our progress. I think when we do a budget, just as we look at sort of the financial impact of these budget decisions, we should be looking at the impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from new sort of budget items or new projects. And I'll be putting that forward. I think it's sensible. I think it strengthens what the government wants to do. In terms of regen ag, there's clearly an opportunity around carbon in Australia. So there's a big review of the Emissions Reduction Fund at the moment by Professor Chubb. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. I think there's potential there. And then, you know, this biodiversity space, it's hard to measure, but I know there's a lot of work. The ANU are doing a lot of work looking at how could you actually measure the impact or the benefit farmers are creating, and how can we reward farmers for that? How can we incentivize farmers for that? You know, it's over 50% of Australia is managed by farmers, so it's such a big opportunity. And you look at the biodiversity crisis and the sort of statistics, it's pretty awful. So we've got a lot of work to do there, but I do think, and that's another thing in the Senate, is looking for existing policy that's coming through and what can actually be amended or tacked on that's going to have these flow-on effect and benefits to farmers.
Yeah, so I've got a question then that's come up, is that how would you as a senator, but you personally, work with the entire community of the ACT to be the independent voice? So you could say on regen ag, but let's just go with climate because it's the topic. So you got in on that. Everyone knows that that's what you were going to back, and that you were really clear that this is a floor, not a ceiling, which was, I have to say, great work getting that into the discussion. But what are your processes, I suppose, in place now to continue to be the voice for the community? What's your thinking on that?
So I guess the wide level is quarterly town halls where anyone can come and ask a question. And then we've obviously got the electorate office where I'm available and we are scheduling meetings. But then on specific topics, so say climate, we've got a climate working group that actually meet themselves to discuss current legislation, or we'll be sort of sending them issues or ideas that they can actually then work up and sort of report back and say, well, this is how we see it, this is what we think you could be doing, or the angle or the potential amendment. And so we'll be setting up, one for climate, one for housing, one for aged care, to really get people in the community who are either experts or just really passionate and interested about these areas to have real input and to be meeting other experts and building that community around these issues. So it's early days. We're still trying to work out exactly how it's going to work, but the climate group is up and running, and we'll be leaning on them. And as being an independent, you don't have the big party machinery that's giving you talking points on issues that are coming up or telling you how to vote. You've got to decide it all. And so having a sort of structures in place to actually be able to access that information from experts and people in the community who are passionate about it, I think is going to be really important to be successful over time as more and more stuff is coming in.
So could I just check with you, would that climate group be on your webpage, and if people participating today from the ACT interested, they could access it? Is it sort of like public like that, or how would people find out about it?
So it's through my website. You can sign up for updates and just put a little note in there, and we'll get back to you. And we've got someone who's sort of helping set these groups up. So that's probably the easiest way to do it.
Yeah. And Claire, do you have anything to add to that? Any other comments?
No, I mean, I think for me, it's across the spread of it's around participation, it's around transparency, it's around accountability, and those different elements. The mechanisms for that engagement is going to need to cover those. But probably for me, it's about going back to that earlier point around the breadth and the depth of that engagement. And I think there's real opportunity to widen who, to build a community of more than 2,000 volunteers is fabulous, but that's just the start. It has to be wider. It has to be, I mean, one of the things that I found really exciting about the campaign was of how many people had never been involved in politics before. And that's a fabulous start. But we need to then be widening that further, people who are actively turned off from politics, and to show how, the reasons why it is important to engage in those topics. So, yeah, I think there's real opportunities for that.
And Cathy, maybe just to add, the other thing that we have started planning is, on upcoming bills that are big bills, and we want to potentially have amendments or have our thinking better, sort of have a more thought through position on them. We're organising sort of one-off roundtables where we'll get a range of experts and then just some people from the community just to sit around for an hour or two and actually talk it through, look at the bill, give us their expertise, and then come away from that with a real sort of thought out position and some potential amendments to get drafted up.
Yeah, gosh, great. And that'll be, so if people are interested in that, again, it's your webpage to sign up and get onto your database. Yeah.
Website's the best place.
Yeah.
We're trying to ensure that all the info is on the website. So
what else do you want to tell us, David, about your approach to the job? Because I'm conscious it's been a big day here, but is there anything else you want to cover off on? There's a question here from Emma Kate. David, what about drafting up a national food and ag white paper? Gosh, that'd be an innovative thing to do. God. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is the kind of thing that does come out of these Senate committees. I know that the North Australia white paper came out of so yeah, it's certainly something that could be done.
Hey, the Penny Scott says, count me in. Now, here's an interesting thing. Penny lives in the Riverina electorate. She doesn't live in the ACT. So I would be fascinated in David's opinion about, like, how much are you the representative of the whole of Australia? How much are you going to be the representative on topics like regen? And how are you going to, manage that workload? What's your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the challenges of being an independent on the crossbench, where you potentially do have to have that deciding vote. Is there's a range of issues that don't necessarily affect the ACT, but I have to be across, and I want to be across. And then there's obviously things that are just really interesting to me, and regen ag is one of them. So as you said, there's other senators who are representing or live in communities that have a much bigger sort of agricultural sector, and I think it's finding the overlap and those interests to actually then be able to do things together, even though it's that Venn diagram, just finding the overlap, working on them, acknowledging that on this other stuff we're not gonna see eye to eye, but that's fine. We can get a lot done when we actually do that, I think.
Yeah.
And just on that, I mean, if I can say, that's part of the reason why we chose to focus on the Senate rather than the lower house. That when we were looking at the issues that you know, are so important to us around climate change issues or integrity or all of these things that prompted the kind of frustration that meant we wanted to do something about it. So many of those, yes, they have an ACT element, or, you know, where whatever electorate someone is in, but they have a national relevance as well. And so, you know, if we want change to happen, yes, we want to have the representation in the lower house, but obviously every piece of legislation goes through the Senate as well. And we can't forget about that. So yeah, it's an interesting mix of the representation from the local level, but also being part of that national conversation as well.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to draw this session to a close. I'll give you anything else. Do you want to make any other comments to the crew, David, before we wrap up?
I'm just having a look. There's a comment from Tony Lane, which I think is interesting. He's kind of talking about how I mentioned David Littleproud, and, you know, how does that sit with people of the ACT kind of saying that the Nats have a good policy? You know, for me, I'll back good ideas from anywhere, and, you know, the scheme that I mentioned that David Littleproud's been working on, they've partnered with David Lindenmayer and a bunch of other academics at the ANU, and it's potentially a really good thing for not only farmers who are doing the right thing, but all Australians. And I think as an independent, one of the things that I want to do is be really honest when I don't know something, to say I don't know, but I'll find out. I'll go and speak to experts or people who do know, but then also not be afraid to actually say, well, there's this senator from WA or Queensland who I really don't agree with on most things, but this is actually a really good idea that's good for all of us, and I'm going to back it. So yeah, we'll see how it goes. I'm sure that's going to, you know, lead to some interesting conversations, but I really think that that transparency and that openness to good ideas is what people want. My sense, talking to, I don't know, thousands of people during the campaign, was that there's this dissatisfaction and frustration with party politics, where no matter how good the idea is from the other side, because they're on the other side, you've got to say, no, that's no good.
Well, can I give you hope in that? I support you totally, and I'm so glad you're saying it, because that one of the biggest wins I had in Parliament was with David Littleproud on the Future Drought Fund. I went to him and said, look, I know all about this. Can I work with you? And he said, absolutely. And I ended up getting all my amendments through Parliament on how we were going to spend that money. So it was that whole sense of come with a solution, not a problem. And I didn't need the glowing testimony. He could have all the joy he wanted. But I was able to say, here's how I know we could do it. And it worked really well. And if you can bring that attitude to reality, which I'm sure you will, gosh, and then together with the House of Reps, people doing that work, I think we're in for such a good future with this country. Okay, so any final word? You want to say something else and then we'll wrap up? No, that's done.
Thank you again.
Yeah.
Cathy. And thanks to everyone on this chat for your interest and for what you're doing in your own communities.
Oh, you can see there's huge interest in this. Yeah,
Can
Claire?
I say a couple of words in terms of those interested in doing some work around the Senate? That's, you know, so much is similar approach around building that community, but, you know, a few thoughts of do the numbers, plan well in advance if you're wanting to get above the line, or also have a chat to Finn around independent voices for the Senate and that model, but also believe that you can do it. We were told time and time again, it's not possible like others were, but it is possible. If you are clear about that pathway, it is possible.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to wrap up before I want to pass over to Jill for the summary of the day. To both of you, but to all the people who ran in the Senate, just fantastic, because the result was amazing. Even though a lot of people didn't get elected, the actual groundswell about it was just huge. David, particularly to wish you well in your work, to know that the community has, not only the community, the ACT, but the community of the community independents have your back, and we really wish you well. And Claire, thank you for your offer of helping organising, because I know you've got a really good relationship with the other people running for the Senate, and you'll continue to be there with your advice and practicality. So thank you for the generosity of that. And I'll just ask everyone to thank these two for their time on Saturday and wish them well for the incredibly important work that they're going to be doing. And I'm particularly keen about the agricultural side of your work, David. And there's a huge number of people in the chat saying, yes, please.